Hey, it's Kat, and I'm back because what once was will begin, at least as far as history is compared to our story of A Song of Ice and Fire. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to use some history and a little legend to divine the mysteries of the Game of Thrones. Now, one of those subjects that we've been talking about is this idea of the princes in the tower. And this idea is extremely pivotal in history. It's one of the most important events because basically if it didn't happen, then you don't get the breaking of the will and the coming of the dawn. Just as a quick recap, if you don't know who the princes in the tower are in history, Edward IV, the King of England, dies and he leaves two young heirs. And he leaves his brother, Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, as their protector. Well, the Duke of Gloucester takes his two nephews and sticks them in the tower. Then shortly thereafter, he has them declared to be bastards, himself crowned King Richard III, and then the princes mysteriously disappear into history. And of course, in history, as soon as that happens, because there are no bodies, there's no funeral that shows that they're actually dead, there are a lot of myths, legends, and theories that are out there about who did it and what happened to them. And these have persisted throughout history. And of course, historically speaking, it's such a pivotal event. It's so important that Mr. Martin has included it in his story of A Song of Ice and Fire and or Game of Thrones. And he's done it several different times. And he's really done it in such a way that he's presented to you not only what history says happens, but he's also played with the theories about what happened to them, as well as what if this happened, then what would have been the outcome. And we've already talked about one of those what ifs in the video regarding who are the Tyrells in history. We talked about what if the two princes in the tower hadn't died and they'd actually ended up sitting on the throne. And in that video, we basically go through the process of, guess what? They probably would have ended up being dead anyways. One, because it has to happen for the progress of history, but two, because in that time period, they are essentially sacrificial lambs set amongst some starving wolves and lions. There was a lot of murder going on at that period, so it was a likelihood that they actually would have died. And so that's the idea that he presents in the Princes in the Tower storyline that we talk about in Who Are the Tyrells. But in this storyline of the Princes in the Tower, Mr. Martin actually plays with one of the theories. So what if Richard III didn't have them killed? And what if they were still alive at the end of Henry Tudor's rebellion? What happened to them? There is this theory out there that maybe Richard III, being their loving uncle, would never have done such a deed, but that when Henry Tudor defeated Richard III and then proceeded to go to London, he either ordered them to be killed himself, or somebody acting on his behest or hoping to maybe get a reward actually went and killed the princes anyway, because they still represented a threat to Henry's rule as much as they would have to Richard III, because as long as they were alive, there were some potential claimants or heirs to the throne on the Yorkist side, and it would have continued rebellion. So this theory is played out in one of the very beginning storylines of A Song of Ice and Fire. You don't actually see it on a Game of Thrones, but you hear references to it. So there's Robert's Rebellion, and after Robert defeats Rhaegar Targaryen, who is nominally Richard III, at the Battle of the Trident, he proceeds to go towards King's Landing. But before he gets there, Tywin's army enters the city and they sack it. Tywin Lannister sends two of his henchmen, Sir Gregor Clegane and Amory Lorch, to the Red Keep, where they go into the tower and they kill Princess Rhaenys, Prince Aegon, and their mother, Elia Martell. Now, in history, two men actually, much later after the events, confess to the murders, and they are one Sir James Tyrell and a John Dighton. And you can see who they are in the video regarding Who Are the Tyrells in history. Now, literally, in history, these two men are the king's henchmen. That's what they're employed as, the king's henchmen. Now, interestingly enough, in history, after Richard is killed and Henry Tudor comes to the throne, these two men who have been employed by Richard III and actually had received some substantial rewards from Richard III remained in Henry Tudor's employ. Of course, they weren't employed in anywhere near the capacities that they had enjoyed under Richard III, but since they remained employed, this had put about a theory or the possibility that maybe it was Henry Tudor. Maybe these two men were actually in the employ of Henry Tudor, and or he convinced them to do it, or they did it in his behest, hoping for some reward. Now, in our story of A Song of Ice and Fire, when Gregor Clegane and Amory Lorch murders the princess and the prince, it's so brutal that their bodies are wrapped up in a blanket or a crimson cloak and presented to Robert. Gregor Clegane smashes Prince Aegon's head against the wall. It's a bloody mess. All anybody can see is a tuft of blonde hair. Rhaenys is stabbed about 100 times, and according to the story, she tried to bite Amory Lorch, and it just caused him to go into a rage, and he just stabbed her repeatedly over and over again. After they're wrapped in a crimson cloak, they are presented to Robert Baratheon, where their bodies, supposedly wrapped in this cloak to cover the blood so it doesn't offend people, are laid at the foot of the steps below the throne. Now, in history, when Tyrell and Dighton give their confessions, they say that they smothered the two princes, and then they wrapped them in a blanket off of the bed, which was probably a crimson color, just like our cloak in our Song of Ice and Fire, because that was a very popular color for royal bedding at the time. And we know that. This is not just a theory. We know it because it's actually in accounts, household accounts from the royal household. And then according to them, they took these wrapped bodies, carried them down out of the tower, and buried them at the foot of the steps in the tower. And this is very symbolic to how it is in a story of A Song of Ice and Fire, because it is the Tower of London where all kings and queens who are getting ready for their coronation go and spend the night before. So, literally, they're laid at the foot of the throne. But, like in our story of A Song of Ice and Fire, as well as in history, there's the question, did it happen before or after the rebellion? And one of the reasons it remains so controversial is because there were no bodies. And this was a problem in history because usually kings and or princes, when they died, they were given a public presentation and or funeral so that everybody could walk by and see that they were actually dead. The king is dead. Long live the king. You might get the idea that Tyrell and Dighton were lying about the manner of the two princes' death, because otherwise they might have been presented as having died a natural death and then buried, and then there would be no question about that they were dead. And this actually happened in history a couple different times. It was like Edward II, Richard II, as well as Henry VI, where history reports or suggests that they were actually murdered, and then they were presented in a funeral as saying, well, they died of natural deaths, really in a coincidentally untimely moment. But just like in our story of A Song of Ice and Fire, these bodies are hidden, and there's probably a good reason for that. Okay, so in our story of A Song of Ice and Fire, after the deed is done, the bodies are presented to Robert Baratheon, and Ned is there, and Ned is just completely disgusted. He can't believe that these two children have been murdered. In fact, he wants somebody to be charged for their murder. Robert basically tries to reason with Ned, and he says, look, it's war. There are no innocents in war. Besides, they're Targaryens, and the Targaryens are dangerous. One, because if any heirs still live, there could be others who will continue to raise a rebellion, and there will be continual civil war and death. Secondly, because, hey, they're Targaryens, and they're notorious for being a little unstable and dangerous to everybody. So here, really, you're getting the historical rationale for why they would have been killed, whether it was Richard III or Henry VII. Because, the Plantagenets, as long as they existed, even on the Yorkist lines, there continued to be this rebellion. And, oh, by the way, look at Henry VI and a few of the other Plantagenets. They're a little, unstable, and that continues to be dangerous to the realm. In a story of A Song of Ice and Fire, Ned just gets disgusted and he freaking leaves. It causes a rift in his relationship with Robert that never really heals. In history, this actually happens to Richard III, as well as Henry VII to some degree. So Richard III, as soon as the rumors start that the princes are dead, everybody's pretty damn sure that he did the deed or ordered it to be done. And some of his followers begin to drop away, including one of those who had supported him consistently for quite some time, the Duke of Buckingham. And Shakespeare, in his Richard III play, suggests that the Duke of Buckingham didn't know about it or wasn't necessarily complicit, or he knew about it or knew it was going to happen, and that he just couldn't stomach it. And this is one of the reasons why he later rose a rebellion. Even into Henry VII's reign, no bodies, no crime, but no bodies who did the deed. You know, there's no confessions. And these rumors about maybe Henry VII might have been complicit were going around at that time as well. So a number of Yorkists who had supported him during his rebellion started to drift away as well. Of course, there were other reasons, but this is one of the reasons that was being given. Now, in history, because there were no bodies and there was no funeral, not only were there all these rumors about who killed them and what happened to them, but rumors, theories, and legends begin to spin around this whole story that maybe one or both of the princes had actually escaped. In one theory, Elizabeth Woodville, who still had possession of her youngest son while the eldest was in the Tower first, that she allegedly spirited her youngest son, Richard, away over to Flanders and then sent some peasant boy to the Tower in his place, and that's who was actually killed. In another similar theory is that when these two henchmen went to go kill the princes in the Tower, they killed the eldest one, but the youngest one had pled for his life so pitifully that they allowed him to live, and they spirited him across the sea over to Flanders. So in our story of A Song of Ice and Fire, a very similar thing is going on. So we hear that supposedly Varys had helped to spirit the real Aegon out of the Tower and instead went to Fleet Bottom and bought some boy, some peasant boy, and that's who he sent up to the Tower, and that's who Gregor Clegane actually killed. And then this Aegon was sent over to Braavos or wherever, where eventually he's given into the care of John Connington, who begins to raise him and tells him all about his Targaryen family, his supposed father, etc., etc. And now in the books, Aegon, along with John Connington, has landed in Westeros with basically a mercenary army of the Golden Company. They're at Griff's Landing or Griff's Roost. It's John Connington's old castle, and they're getting ready to march on King's Landing. And this is basically where it stops with history, because the next book isn't out. But now we're going to talk about what actually happens in history. Now, in history, there are actually two pretenders during Henry Tudor's reign. One was Lambert Simnel, and the other one was a Perkin Warbeck. Now, Lambert Simnel first tried to claim that he was the eldest, Edward V, who would have been the direct heir of the throne. Then he claimed to be Edward, the Earl of Warwick, Edward IV's brother's son, who was actually locked in the Tower. And so all Henry Tudor really did was pull this dude out of the Tower and say, look, this is the real one. This guy's not real. And so Lambert Simnel's rebellion pretty much drifted away. And then he captured him, and he didn't kill him, though. He ended up putting him to work in his kitchens. Now, Perkin Warbeck is actually the one that's a little more similar to the Aegon story, where he comes up and he starts talking about how he was raised in Flanders, and he knows all this stuff about what happened with his family. He kind of looks like a Plantagenet. He's tall and blonde. He talks the talk a little bit. He walks the walk. Eventually, the nobles in Europe give him a small mercenary army. He lands in England, where he is eventually defeated, and he's captured. And just like Lambert Simnel, though, he's not killed. He goes to Henry's court for about 2 years, where unfortunately he does try to commit treason, and he is eventually beheaded. Some people think that this pretender, Perkin Warbeck, might have been one of Edward IV's many bastards. Now the question is, which one of those two events is going to be Aegon's fate in A Story of A Song of Ice and Fire? Because we're pretty sure that he's a pretender and possibly a Blackfyre bastard. But thank you very much. Hit the like button, leave a comment. I will talk to you guys later.